people driving in their cars. And you'll even hear a phenomenon called picket fencing. And it's the kind of the idea, the concept where sunlight shining through picket fences, bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark as you drive. And it's your signal is multipathing and coming in direct, multipath and direct. And it's causing that kind of interference. Now, it's not all the time and it's not really a big deal, but it is something that you can observe and something that you can know. You can hear this phenomenon often if you're listening to a relatively weak FM radio signal in your car. You pull up to an intersection and the signal just kind of goes away. And even if you just ease up off that brake pedal and just go a few feet forward, and all of a sudden it's back in. That's exactly what is happening. You've already experienced that and probably never understood or knew what was happening. What term commonly used to describe the rapid fluttering sound sometimes heard from mobile stations that are moving while transmitting? Picket fencing. Which of the following applies when two signals transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other? So common courtesy should prevail, but no one has the absolute right to an amateur frequency. So you can't just say, well, this is my frequency. This is mine. I always talk on it. I don't want you to be here. People get like that. I'm serious. They do. They're like, well, this is where I always talk. Well, not today. I got here first. So, but yeah, so nobody has the absolute right to a frequency. Right. Right. Yes. Well, I don't know. They might start a holy war over their frequency sometimes. You'd be surprised. Yeah, you would just move on. Yep. Which cue signal indicates that you are receiving interference from other stations? The answer is QRM. This is just something for you to memorize.
Do you have to memorize all of those for the test?
No, they're not all on the test. Only the ones that are on the test that you have to memorize. Well, your book contains every test question, so. Yep. No. Which cue signal indicates that you are changing frequency? It's QSY. Again, it's just, you memorize it. It was in the book. When you're doing your self-study and taking this practice test online, they'll come up. You'll get it and you'll remember it. That's what there is to it. There's nothing else about it.
You guys, okay, this is a legit question though. Do you use these abbreviations like we use BRB?
Yes.
ETLI?
Absolutely.
So you use these. So
Yep.
you have them all memorized.
Yeah. Well, not everyone. There's some that are, you memorize the very common ones. So a really good example. I'm talking to somebody on HF. Remember, it's entirely possible to only hear one side of the conversation. It's entirely possible that somebody is on your same frequency and you can't hear them at all. Atmospheric conditions change. All of a sudden, their signal starts coming in. I would say, hey, I've got some QRM. And then you would say, okay, let's QSY to 140 to, whatever. These Q codes are they were invented for Morse code because it takes a lot of dots and dashes to try to say I'm changing frequency or I have interference. It's real easy to say QRM. People do use them verbally though, but they're very heavily used in Morse code. It's easy to say change frequency too, but I might get on there and say K7DS K7DN QSY 14.250, and then clear off, just so anybody hears me. What operating activities involve contacting as many stations as possible during a specified period? Contesting. So you have a radio contest. There are countless radio contests. They're usually published in that magazine that the ARRL puts out. So you can find out what band or even sometimes what frequencies that the contest is on, what the contest is. There's a really neat one that Ohio has. It's called Ohio State Parks on the Air. And people go and set up in the various state parks around Ohio and try to make as many contacts. When I lived here in Ohio, my group up in Champaign County, we were winners 4 years in a row. We'd set up big, about 5 or 6 different stations, big antennas, everybody with generators and campers, and we'd be up operating for 24 hours, just nonstop, just over a weekend. And anyways, it's something very interesting to do. You win awards. They usually send you a little plaque or certificate and say that you won. Which of the following is a good procedure when contacting another station in a radio contest? The answer is send only the minimum information needed for proper identification and the contest exchange. The reason for that is this is a contest. The objective is to make as many contacts as fast as possible. Nobody wants to hear about your grandma and your cat and everything else. We're in a rush. Get off the frequency so I can talk to the next person. So when somebody responds back, I don't want to have a conversation. I just want whatever information is necessary for the contest. It's usually going to be your call sign, my signal report, and where you're located, or maybe it's a sequential number. Contact number 1, then the next person number 2, and number 3. And so that's what you're exchanging. What is a grid locator? A grid locator is a letter number designator assigned to a geographic location. And so in ham radio, there is one in your book. I don't know where it's at, but they have an overlay of the United States, and they've got grid numbers and grid squares. And it's basically a way to subdivide area. And they get even more granular than that. And the purpose for that is to be able to identify where somebody is more specifically at. They have a lot of contests. They have contests that like work all grids. And that's a very tiny grid. I mean, there are many, many hundreds of grids. And so it's you're able to make a contact with somebody in every one of those little tiny places. And that's often accommodated or accomplished by people doing portable operations. They're actually going to a place because there may be a grid where there are no ham radio operators. So the only way to ever communicate to that is somebody went there, set up a station so that you could do it. All right, so now we're going to talk about repeaters. What type of amateur station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? And that is repeater. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? The answer is repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. Repeater we already talked about. Space stations we already talked about. It's a satellite. Auxiliary would be just simply if I have a transmitter at my house connected essentially to another radio, where it's going to relay that transmission out on another frequency, not for the purpose of repeating. It doesn't go back. Essentially for a one-way communication. That would be an auxiliary station. Many mobile radios, particularly higher end mobile radios, have a feature called crossband repeat. And crossband repeat is like a repeater, except it doesn't only do it on two different frequencies. They are two different frequencies, but it actually does it on two different bands. And the purpose of this could be that you have a repeater that is too far away for you to reach with your handheld, but your mobile radio with its car antenna and more power can get into. But yet you're going to be walking around at a mall or in a field. Well, your handheld can't get into the repeater, but your handheld definitely can get to your car, which is just across the field. And so you enable this crossband repeat, and then your handheld talks to your car simultaneously retransmits that up to the repeater, and then when your car hears the repeater, it receives it and simultaneously sends it back on the other band to your handheld. So it gives you some remote capabilities to extend the range of your handheld. No, that's crossband repeat. Yep. What is meant by repeater offset? And the answer is it's the difference between a repeater's transmit frequency and its receive frequency. So when I drew up here on the board, I said we had a repeater that transmitted on 443.350, and then it received on 448.350. The offset would be plus 5 megahertz. So the offset is just the difference between the transmit and the receive. On the 70 centimeter band, which is that 440 megahertz range, the offset is standard. Doesn't mean it can't vary from this. It's standard by gentleman's agreement by that band plan to be plus 5 megahertz. So if somebody told me, oh, my repeater is 440.0, well, then I know that the repeater is going to receive me at 445.0. It's up, it's shifted 5 megahertz. On the 2 meter band, which is that 144 megahertz band, it's plus or minus, depending on where in the frequency range, 600 kilohertz is its standard. Again, if any Japanese radio will set those offsets for you automatically, whether it's the plus or minus and whether it's 5 megahertz or 600, it does it for you completely automatically. The Chinese radio, you're going to have to program that in yourself. No big deal, but again, it's much easier accomplished on the Japanese radio because it does it for you automatically, and it's really meant for, it's a true ham radio compared to a commercial radio.
Are we supposed to know any of those offsets?
I believe that they are on the test. Yep. What is the most common use of the reverse split function of a VHF UHF transceiver? And it's to listen on the repeater's input frequency. So remember, your radio transmits on one frequency and receives on another. That's opposite of what the repeater transmits on and receives. So the repeater has to be opposite in order to receive you. So if you hit the reverse button and now you choose to receive on the transmit frequency, that allows you to hear what the repeater hears instead of hearing the repeater itself. Make sure people understand this. All right, so here's the repeater is up here, okay? And the repeater transmits on 145 and it receives on 146. Okay? In order for you to transmit to the repeater, what does your radio need to be tuned to? 146, because that's where the repeater hears. So if the repeater hears there, I have to transmit on 146 in order to get to the repeater, and I have to receive on 145 in order to hear the repeater. You can see they're opposite of each other. That means if there's somebody over here they're set up the exact same way because they're not transmitting to me. They might be talking to me, but they don't transmit to me. They transmit to the repeater. So they have to transmit up to the repeater on the frequency that the repeater is listening on, and they have to receive on the frequency that the repeater is transmitting on. That's the way that works. If my radio is set up to talk on a repeater, and you and I are driving in cars, or separate cars, and we're talking to each other through the repeater, that's fine. The repeater repeats, and we hear each other, and we're conversing through the repeater. But all of a sudden, we drive far enough that we're out of range of the repeater. Can we still talk? The answer would be no. Because our transmitters are transmitting on 146, and our receivers are receiving on 145. You're not transmitting on the frequency that I'm receiving on, and vice versa. It only worked because the repeater was in the middle and was relaying that. So we'd have to drop to a simplex frequency. We'd have to go to we're on the same frequency. If this person, let's say I'm very close to the repeater. I'm here in town. I'm close to it. And this person is actually way out past me talking into the repeater. But they're real scratchy. They're having a hard time coming in. The signal's not very strong. I could hit the reverse button, which what does reverse do? It just reverses. It makes my transmit what was the receive frequency and makes the receive what was the transmit frequency. It switches them, reverses them. And now I'm matched up with the repeater. So now I can't talk to the repeater anymore, but I can hear what the repeater hears. So if I hit the reverse button and I can hear you talking to the repeater, I can't hear the repeater anymore, but I can actually hear you. That means I'm hearing you direct. And I can say, hey, we don't need to talk on the repeater. You and I are close enough that we can talk to each other. That's how I know. Because now I'm listening to the input frequency. I'm listening to you transmitting into the repeater, and I can hear it and say, oh, we don't even need the repeater. Let's just go simplex. And we change frequencies and talk to each other directly. Pretty much, yes.
For some reason, across your receiver, you can't hear that. Is that correct?
Well, I'm out of range.
Where you
Yes, yep. Well, we'd have to change frequencies. We wouldn't continue to talk on the repeaters. Yeah, if I hit, when I'm set up, I'm receiving on the frequency that the repeater transmits on, and I'm transmitting on the frequency the repeater receives on. Okay. But yes, there are two different frequencies. And that's why this is station number 1, and this is station number 2. We cannot talk directly because we're not set up to transmit and receive on the same frequency as each other. We're set up to transmit to the repeater's receiver and to receive from the repeater's transmitter. So we're exchanging information in this circular fashion on two different channels. In order for me to talk to this person, I have to go through the repeater because of this offset, because we're not on a simplex frequency.
It's like a three-way call. So if I call Leah, and then we call, and then I add Matt to mine, you're on my, I'm the repeater. But if they want to talk to each other and I hang up, they can't communicate. And they have to call each other directly. Is that right?
Well, a way that it is, another way that I could describe it is, imagine if we didn't have three-way calling. And I give you, and I have two telephones because I don't have three-way calling. So if I want 3 calls, I have to have 2 telephones. I give you one phone number, I give you the other phone number, but I wanted to let you two talk to each other. What would I have to do? Well, I would take one phone, flip it upside down, right? Because the sound comes out here and the sound goes in here. I would have to flip them upside down and put them together so that the microphone from the one phone picks up the speaker from the other, and the speaker from the other goes into the microphone. And so that way, that's what they're doing. It's why they're reversed. But if we are all in the same room, well, there's not 2 different channels. There's not a speaker and a microphone. It's all one. That's the simplex. And so all that's happening here is I'm speaking and hearing on these different channels or frequencies, and the repeater is combining them together and allowing them, the other person, to hear. But if we just take your phone and my phone and just mash them together like this, then it's not going to work because we're both going to be talking up here or hearing up here and talking down here, and they'll not be interconnected. So what this allows us to do is, if somebody is not coming into the repeater well, I can hit that reverse button, which allows me to hear on the same frequency that the repeater hears on. And if I hear you there, I'm not hearing you from the repeater, I'm hearing it from you. Then I can say, hey, we're close enough just to talk direct. We don't need the repeater. We agree on some simplex frequency, some other frequency that's not from the repeater, and then we move over there. Or because you and I are both in cars, we're only 1,000 feet apart on the car, but we're 100 miles from the repeater. So we can't get back to the repeater. It's 100 miles away, but you and I are only 1,000 feet apart. Yep. If a station is not strong enough to keep the repeater's receiver squelch open, which of the following might allow you to receive the station's signal? So you're talking through the repeater, the other station is noisy. They're not quite making it. What could you do? What we just talked about. Try that reverse split and see if you can hear their signal any better, because then you're hearing them direct and you don't even need to go through the repeater. Or maybe it's only temporary. Maybe they're temporarily dropped into a valley, but yet your station is capable of hearing them, but the geography causes the repeater not to. You just do that temporarily until they get up out of the valley, and then you switch back to the standard repeater offset. I can't tell you the number of people who get so excited. They're like, I talked to somebody down in Kentucky just on my handheld. It made it all the way to Kentucky. No, it didn't. Your handheld made it all the way to the repeater, and then the repeater made it all the way into Kentucky. You did not communicate. Station 1 did not talk to Station 2. You talked to the repeater. That's it. Your radio is not that impressive. But people just, they don't get the concept. They're like, but I talked to them. No, you talk to the repeater, right? And the repeater retransmits what they say. Somebody asked, is this on the test, the offsets? And the answer is yes, here you go. What is the standard offset for the 2-meter band? I mentioned this before, plus or minus 600 kilohertz. It's 5 megahertz on 70 centimeters. 2 meters plus or minus 600. I don't think it is on the test. The 2 meters and 70 centimeters are the most popular. You know, your $30 radio has those bands in it. And so they've always been, you know, whatever's popular is what your radio comes with, right? And so when your radio comes with that, that's what everybody will be on. What's the common repeater frequency offset in the 70 centimeter band? They say plus or minus 5 megahertz. 5 megahertz is the thing to know there. Which of the following could be the reason you are unable to access a repeater whose output you can hear? So you're obviously within range of the repeater. You hear the repeater. What's wrong? All of these could be wrong. Improper offset. Maybe it's minus 600 kilohertz and you set it to positive 600. Well, then you're not transmitting on the right frequency. The repeater, you're not even on the same frequency that the repeater is. The repeater may require a proper CTCSS tone from your transceiver. CTCSS is continuous tone coded squelch system. You don't need to know that. What it is subaudible. It means your ear can't pick it up, but it is sound. And your radio sends out a tone that you can't hear, but the repeater can. So if the repeater picks up interference from something in the area, or it could even be that there's 2 repeaters that are not, they're far apart, but not quite far apart. And every once in a while, the signal from one gets into the other. They could put a tone on it and tell all the people in the local area, put this tone on your radio. And when you key up, the repeater hears that tone and then it starts retransmitting. But if it hears a signal that doesn't have the tone, it stays quiet. It pretends like there's no signal there. So that's the purpose of that. Repeater may require a proper DCS tone. That's digital coded squelch. It's just another type of tone. works the exact same way. And all of these choices are correct. So it could be any of these causes. In that repeaterbook.com, when you look up your repeater, nearly every repeater has a tone on it. Some don't, especially if they're very rural. But in this area, being so close to Cincinnati, they're going to have a tone. And they publish that tone. They want you to know what the tone is. If you have a very nice, another case for a Japanese radio, a lot of times they'll have tone scan. So you're receiving the repeater, you hit a button and it scans through and locks on and finds the tone for you. It's a pretty nice feature, but it's almost always published. Only if you have a trunked radio, which there are no amateur radios marketed with that capability. But you could get a commercial radio that does work on amateur. What term describes the use of subaudible tone transmitted along with normal voice audio to open the squelch of a receiver? We just talked about this, CTCSS, continuous tone coded squelch system. What brief statement indicates that you are listening on a repeater and looking for a contact? Simply say your call sign. You can say monitoring. They're recommending that you don't say CQ. So K7DN monitoring or just K7DN. People know, oh, there's K7DN. If I want to talk to them, I can talk to them. Which of the following describes a linked repeater network? It's a network of repeaters where signals received by one repeater are repeated by all the repeaters. So we talked a little bit about this before. The reason why repeaters are not linked, well, why one repeater doesn't repeat another, which is not the same as being a linked repeater, is that in order for you to talk to a repeater, you have to transmit to the repeater's receiver and receive on the repeater's transmitter, right? Because they're different frequencies, different flows. They're one way each way. If I put a repeater that could talk into this repeater, remember, the repeater automatically retransmits everything it hears. So as soon as I key up one repeater, it's going to transmit here and come back down here and come into an infinite loop because they will start retransmitting what each other hears simultaneously and they'll never stop. It'll lock them up and they'll be completely unusable. That's why you can't have just repeaters stationed close enough to hear each other. They never can do that. So what you would do is you'd have repeater on this set of frequencies, a repeater on a different set, a repeater on a third set, all different unique sets of frequencies. And then you would have some other mechanism other than their receivers and transmitters, something outside of those, maybe a phone line, or it even could be a radio link on a completely different band that allows that audio to go between them. But that's why they're a link system and it's not just simply repeaters close to each other. See, that's why you have to understand how repeaters have separate transmit and receive to understand why you couldn't allow that to happen, because they will just sit there and loop each other up. Which of the following entities recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? The answer is volunteer frequency coordinators recognized by local amateurs. Government, 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 right? These are recommendations. The government rarely recommends anything to you. They tell you what to do. If it's a recommendation, it's just that. It's an agreement. Hey, let's agree that we will transmit here and not here, or vice versa.
So basically, you're saying that someone would set up their own repeater, they would go through these volunteer frequency coordination, you're not going to
Yes.
something else.
Yep. And there's lots of people that are like, oh, I don't have to do that. The FCC says I'm allowed to transmit. And that is 100% true. And if you find an unused frequency pair, you can put up your repeater. You don't need their permission. The problem is when you don't seek their permission, but yet somebody else does, and they say, well, this pair is unused because we don't recognize it. Nobody ever came to us to ask for it. And then they give it to you, but you're already on it. Guess who loses? You, who didn't go through them. Because the FCC will say, no, nobody is entitled to a frequency. It's not yours to own. But they say you can't cause willful interference, and we have a group cooperating here, and you're being the odd man out. And so you want to do that, but you don't have to. And if you go to rural South Dakota, there's nothing. There probably isn't even a repeater coordinator, because you and the one other hand there can pick whatever frequencies you want. But this one is easy to understand because we see it's a recommendation, and it's not government, not government, not government. So it's, government doesn't give you recommendations. They give you orders. Who selects a frequency coordinator? And it's the amateur operators in a local or regional area. Not the government, not the government, not the government. This is that gentleman's agreement. It's who decides amongst ourselves. What method of call sign identification is required for a station transmitting phone signals? What's phone mean? Voice. So how do we identify our voice signal? And the answer is with Morse code or with voice. So you can identify yourself either using Morse code or your voice. And if you're using voice, it has to be in English. All right, which of the following is accepted practice to get the immediate attention of a net control station when reporting an emergency? So we talked about what a net is before. So it's when a group of people come together on a frequency, and it could be a repeater, it could also be simplex. And we have a net control operator, that's generally the person running things and organizing it, and allowing people to check in and converse amongst themselves. Well, how do you break in, or what's the acceptable way to get attention? And it's you begin your transmission by saying priority or emergency followed by your call sign. It's basically, you want them to understand, because lots of people are going to be calling them. You want them to understand that you have an emergency or priority. Which of the following is an accepted practice for an amateur operator who has checked into a net? The answer is remain on frequency without transmitting until asked to do so by the net control station. So the way this works, as I mentioned before, they're going to say this is K7DN with the Milford Amateur Radio Net. We'd like to start allowing for check-ins. That doesn't mean you're the first one up and you get to just start talking. You would then say your call sign, and then another person's going to say their call sign, and people will start going through, and all the while I'm writing them down. And then I will acknowledge them and say, okay, person one, go ahead. And at that point, you can talk, because everyone is going to be trying to check in at the same time once I open up check-ins.
A question back on the emergency thing. They want to know, can you use Mayday?
Yes, you could. There's also, this is more about etiquette, not law. Yeah. Although I would say, although again, not a law thing, May Day typically represents that you are a station in distress. It could be that you're reporting on an emergency, which is not, you're not in distress. So you may not want to use it in that case, but it would not be illegal. When
So you have found this frequency, and there's people on it. You check in, you give your call sign.
Well, this is for a net, not just people talking on a frequency. Well, because you'd hear people checking in, or they would be discussing that it is a net.
Okay, so something, but it said, question, yes, checked into that. So then, does that mean you're just looking and just listening?
Well, it says you've checked in, which means you've given your call sign.
Give me a call thing, and then you just show up and listen?
Yes, because they're going to be receiving everyone else who's giving their call signs. And after they've received enough, then they go back and start acknowledging people and give you the opportunity to talk. You don't want to be talking because other people are trying to check in. It's not your opportunity to talk yet.
Who starts at that? Like, what would you think? Obviously, there's some sort of set time and space, or just like, hey.
Yeah, it is usually a set time. And so a local radio club oftentimes holds a net. You know, you might have the club net. On HF, they have HF nets, and they're on specific frequencies at specific times. Yep. They have a Good Sam RV net on HF. Obviously, people driving around the country in an RV get on HF, and it's pretty nice because you get to know these people, and you could be anywhere in the country able to communicate and oftentimes meet up, like, hey, I'm going to be in Fort Lauderdale this weekend. Oh, I might go down there too. And, you know, I'm coming from Arizona. And so they have nets. It's basically just people of a common interest to be able to talk and check in. And sometimes the net is just to see how far you're able to be heard or reached. Yep. Similar to a contest, but it's not a contest. It's a casual thing. When do the FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur station? The answer is never. Never. Yep. The FCC rules always apply. This is, of course, assuming within the United States. Which of the following describes the radio amateur civil emergency service, RACES? And it is all of the above. RACES is a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications, a radio service using amateur radio stations for emergency management or civil defense communications, and an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. And so oftentimes the Office of Emergency Management Association, the EMA, within your county will have an amateur radio group associated with them that assists them in those types of communications. Then we have ARIES. What is ARIES? The Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And ARIES is licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty to the public service. So where RACES is coordinated by the local government, ARIES is more on the private sector side. They may offer assistance up versus being called upon. So one is tied in with the government, and this one is done privately. What do RACES and ARIES have in common? And that both organizations may provide emergency communications during emergencies. Are amateur radio station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license? The answer is yes, but only if necessary in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or the protection of property. So it would be possible to go outside of your amateur privileges, but generally also not a good idea. It's kind of like just because you can doesn't mean you should type of thing, because that will be heavily scrutinized and they probably will come into, was there another means available to you? Well, yeah, I could have picked up my phone, but I wanted to use my ham radio to do it. It's not going to go over real well that way. What is meant by the term NCS used in iNet operation? Sorry, used in net operation. NCS is the net control station. So we have a net that we're operating, and net control is the person operating the net. What does the term traffic refer to in net operations? Traffic is formal message exchange by net stations. And so they will say, you know, here's the net. Do you have any traffic? And that could be that you're relaying that third-party communications traffic. And maybe it's because you're stationed at the Red Cross, and the Red Cross wants to get communications up to the county emergency management office. Okay, so you're going to relay that communications via ham radio, and that is traffic. So that would be a formal message being relayed up to the net. What information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? The information needed to track the message. When you get into why is this here? You know, what do you do about it? You memorize it. This is not something about that. The only thing I can tell you is why this is the way it is. When you're handling formal traffic, so when you're actually part of an ARIES or RACES group and they're relaying government and life safety and other types of information, they want to be able to track the message, where it came from and who it's from and who it went through. And so they can kind of understand the relay process. This is what allows them to see who that is. And that's called the preamble, pre meaning before. So this is before the message, kind of like your email. What comes before the actual email of somebody saying, hey, how are you? Glad to see you this weekend. What says who it went to and who it's from and what the subject line is. That would be like the preamble. Well, it doesn't have to, it's not only about emergency, but its primary purpose is for emergency. And there's a preamble because it's a formal message traffic. It's not just casual. It's not just, oh, hey, I wanted to let you know that Billy said hi. Yeah.
Explain the net stations and then why they would be sending formal messages.
Well, the net station is the coordinator. So they're coordinating all the communications, and they may be exchanging traffic, which is a formal message, because a good example is, again, the Red Cross. So if a ham radio operator is stationed at the Red Cross, they're receiving messages from the Red Cross. The message could be, we've just dispatched people to such and such neighborhood. And then, but the Red Cross isn't a ham radio operator. They need hams to then relay that message to the county EMA, and the county EMA is now, they're writing that down so they really can track where all the resources are at. And that way, if they don't hear from the Red Cross, ooh, something might have happened to them. Where were they at last? Then they say, well, let's go. They send the police then to go look for them in that neighborhood because, you know, natural disaster, maybe there's a gas fire or something. Net control is the controller of the net, and the net could be a formal net or it could be an informal net. Could be passing emergency traffic or casual traffic. A net is people joining together and talking.
It's almost like common sense. If you walk into a conversation and people are talking about the guy whose arm is cut off outside, you know they're not saying, hey, what'd you have for dinner last night? So I think this has to use common sense. Am I right about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You'll hear it. And then the net control should be announcing on a regular basis, this is the emergency management net, because they also don't want random people deciding to check in and talk. It's not for that. Or maybe they do want random people to check in and talk because it is, hey, anyone in the area, we want you to join us. Well, no, because they choose to define the term traffic as a formal message.
Right. It's the number of stations checking in, it's not traffic.
So B would be, like, usually have to limit B. But, request to actually identify service agency, wouldn't that be traffic also? Wouldn't that be? No, that's the net operator going to set up. Initiate, set the agency. That's not, it's the actual cars driving back and forth, which is the message.
Plus, there can be, although it should be minimized, but there could even be a legitimate reason for there to be other type of chit chat. It could be, hey, I'm repositioning to this part of the neighborhood because there's a problem. And nobody needs to know that except net control. They're just knowing that I'm moving. Or, hey, I have to go to the restroom. I'm shutting operations down for 5 minutes. That's not formal traffic. That's not about the operation that's going on. It's just informs net control that don't call me for the next 5 minutes because I'm not going to respond. No, it's not traffic. No. It's not relevant to the operation of the net. The operation of the net, the purpose of the net is to communicate about the emergency.
But there's no emergency mentioned. I don't see where they make the emergency. Yeah, okay. But the term traffic referred to in net operation. You build a net because everybody's going to the baseball game and when the kids go to who's coaching. Isn't that also in net? I mean, and that can be separate from the emergency.
Sure.
So.
Who's the net controller? Just the first person who sets it up.
The person who operates the net, how they determine that could be, because that's, yeah, yep, yep, absolutely. You could get on a repeater as soon as you get your license and say, announce, this is a net, and start running it and see who will check in. Yep. However long you want it to last, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Which of the following is a characteristic of good traffic handling? And the answer is passing messages exactly as received. So we've all, played the telephone game as kids, and the message gets kind of distorted. We never want to add our own opinion or insight to that. It's whatever they said, you want it to get there exactly as they sent it. What should be done when using voice modes to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly? Spell the words using a standard phonetic alphabet. So if they're having trouble understanding the word that you're saying, spell it out phonetically and use proper phonetics. What is meant by the term check in reference to a formal traffic message? The answer is the number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of a message. And so if my message says, hello, good morning, then the check would be 3. There's 3 words there. That way, when the message, as it gets relayed 100 times over, and then all of a sudden they see that the check was 3, but there's 5 words written down on the paper, something went wrong. Somebody started adding things as the message was passed
Can
along.
you give us an example of when you would use, like, you would use that word check in a conversation when you're relaying these messages? How would you say it?
So if you're reading a message, you're going to be given a format.
Okay.
And that format is going to have that preamble, which includes like the message routing, like who it originated from, and maybe which station first heard it, and then who got it next, and who got it. So it'll include all that information. But this will be on a form for you that you're just filling out. You'll add your portion, and then it'll have the check at the end. And it'll say check, and then you'll write the number, whatever the word count is there.
You say it out loud.
Yeah, so you're going to read it, and you're going to start, you'll read preamble is, and then you'll say whatever content's in the preamble. Message is, say the message, check is. Yeah. Because somebody who you're reading this to is writing it in their form, which is the same as yours. That, we can't just fax the paper over. That's ideally, you just send an email with this over, but all infrastructure is down. All we have are radios. And in fact, we're trying to reach people that are so far apart that it has to be relayed from station to station. And so this is how we verbally take a piece of paper and get it from one spot to the other, with people manually copying it down at each point.
So you would say checks with 5 words.
Yeah. All right. This gets into some more fun stuff. We get away from the law and get into some more interesting things. Why do VHF and UHF radio signals usually travel somewhat further than the visual line of sight between 2 stations? And the answer is the Earth seems less curved to radio waves than light. The frequency of a signal and its wavelength determines the characteristics of that signal. So signals that are considered to be line of sight signals typically only go line of sight, means they're not bouncing off the atmosphere and coming back down. But depending on How small that wavelength is depends on how much they have the ability to bend or refract around the curvature of the Earth. So light waves are extremely high frequencies and would be very, very small wavelengths, and they just don't have the ability to refract around. They will generally, as soon as they hit an object, they immediately terminate. They can't bend beyond it. The reason and the benefit to the light can't bend and it generally has to travel in that true straight line is the reason that we have lasers, that we can combine them and focus them, and they will hold that very tight laser beam as opposed to just being very broad. Why might the range of VHF and UHF signals be greater in the winter? Less absorption by vegetation. So your TV, you can pick up signals better in the winter. And if you got a spotty signal that just barely comes in, well, this summer, you're probably not watching that channel. How might fog and light rain affect radio range on the 10 and 6 meter bands? Fog and light rain will have little effect on these bands. So the wavelength is long enough on those bands that fog and light rain don't impact it. It's just not impacted. But smaller wavelengths, higher frequencies will definitely be impacted by that. Why are direct, not via repeater, UHF signals rarely heard from stations outside your local coverage area? And it's because UHF signals are usually not reflected by the ionosphere. So we have the Earth, and we have an ionosphere around the Earth. The ionosphere is actually in multiple layers, and that is on your test and in your book. I'm just going to draw one layer for now. And if you have an antenna here and an antenna here, when this signal goes to transmit, it goes along the surface of the Earth until it breaks off, and then it just continues through the ionosphere. It penetrates the ionosphere and goes off into space, in theory, indefinitely. This signal cannot communicate with this guy. They will not be able to hear each other. Now, this is, let's say, a UHF frequency. If I use a long wavelength frequency like HF, my signal will come here, but as it hits the atmosphere, it gets reflected. It does not penetrate. It bounces back down and is able to be received by that person on the other side of the Earth. This is HF. That is how these communications, worldwide communications, work. Because the ionosphere.
Learned something today.
How effective would it be if I had a satellite that was on HF frequencies? Not very effective, because if I send an HF signal, it doesn't penetrate the ionosphere. It would never get to the satellite. Right, it will never make it there. It gets blocked. So if I want to send a signal to a satellite or to the moon, I'm going to have to use a VHF, or more preferably a UHF signal, because some VHF signals do penetrate, but they also reflect. They're kind of like in the in-between. And so if I want maximum signal into outer space, I want a UHF frequency. Yes, absolutely.
And the numbers of that, like the band numbers of that, like what?
Well, so remember, the band is really what meter band, and what that therefore represents what wavelength. And so the smaller the wavelength, the more likely it is to penetrate. You know, imagine the ionosphere, you know, as a net, you know, a grid, and it's, well, obviously a signal that's this big can fit through, but one that's this big gets caught up in the net. And so these long wavelengths on the HF frequencies hit that and then just get bounced right back in. These smaller ones, especially, let's say this is VHF, and this little guy is a UHF, you know, it.
Can exchange the word small or thin?
Mm,
Fat, because that's kind of like the way my brain is seeing that, like when you make that net, I think like a thinner. is that
it
not-
really should be like length,
Okay.
shorter wavelengths. Yep, so the little short particle makes it through, but this bigger one scrapes through, and then this one gets caught up in it completely and gets bounced back.
Okay. Tall people are not going to outer space, midgets are.
Yes. Yep.
There you go.
We'll go for it.
Nobody will ever forget that. Let me write that down.
Which of the following effects might cause radio signals to be heard despite obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations? The answer is knife edge refraction. And there is a phenomenon where you could have a mountain, and this is drawn as an illustration in your book. You've got an antenna here, an antenna here. Obviously, passing through this mountain is a no-go. However, the signal will have a tendency, as it hits this edge, to arc down, and it's called knife edge refraction. And that's what can allow that to happen. And that usually would happen on the VHF frequencies, because the smaller that wavelength gets, the more narrow and tightly packed it is, and it will have that tendency to go absolutely straight. It won't want to arc or bend down. What mode is responsible for allowing over the horizon? So that would be non-line of sight. That means you're reaching beyond the horizon. VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis. The answer is tropospheric ducting. So if you remember a little bit earlier, we talked about what happens to 6 meter and 10 meter frequencies in light rain or fog? And the answer was nothing. They're generally unaffected. Well, imagine if you have the ocean here, and then you have a dense fog layer here, and then you have a VHF or UHF signal, which is impacted by water, fog and rain. And you send that signal, and it's going to ping pong between there, where normally it would just travel in a straight line up in and penetrate through the ionosphere and go off into outer space. But instead, it hits this fog layer, gets reflected down, hits the water, gets reflected back, and it sits there and ping pongs back and forth. And a signal, which because of the curvature of the Earth, cannot go straight through, but it hits this fog layer and it gets reflected down and goes much further than its typical range of communications. I said 10 or 6 meters. This was a VHF or UHF, much higher. Yep. Correct, because their wavelength's very long. Yep. The Earth, because of the curvature of the Earth, generally you can only get a straight line about 13 miles, somewhere in there. And so in order to overcome the curvature of the Earth, your signal has to either bend around it, which VHF signals can do a little bit, or you go up in height. So it's like 13 miles at the height of an average person, so 6 feet. So in theory, if you stood on the beach, you would only be able to see a ship 13 miles away. 14 miles away, the curvature of the Earth would block your line of sight to them. Now you stand up on a lifeguard tower, now you're 10 feet off the ground, you can see even further. Yeah, I mean, this is a dense fog layer, so some kind of storm or. Yes. Yep. So yeah, it goes very far. So people in California, typically on 2 meters or 70 centimeters, could not talk to someone in Hawaii. It's too far away. The signal goes off into the ionosphere and terminates into the ocean because of the curvature of the Earth. But with tropospheric ducting, you've seen the fog in San Francisco. They get weather out there, obviously not right in San Francisco. We're talking about out in the ocean, some distance away. And that fog opens up these tropospheric ducting conditions, and people in California can talk to people in Hawaii on 2 meters or 70 centimeters when normally they couldn't. And how do you know? Well, you all of a sudden start hearing signals coming in from places you've never heard before. What causes tropospheric ducting? Temperature inversions in the atmosphere. So hot and cold, when they collide, they create the storms out of the ocean, generate that high humidity. What weather condition would decrease range at microwave frequencies? Remember, what does your microwave oven do? How does it work? It vibrates water molecules, so it interacts with water molecules. So what do you think would bother microwave frequency? Water molecules, precipitation. What is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral reflection? Auroral reflection, also known as aurora borealis, the northern lights. Signals exhibit a rapid fluctuation of strength and often sound distorted. So you can take your 2-meter signal, which normally would penetrate right through the atmosphere, but because there is intense atmospheric conditions causing northern lights, which allows you to visually see it with your eyes, that's so intense and so dense, it causes your signal to reflect, so you'll get it from very far away. But as you've seen with the northern lights, they look like waves in the sky. They kind of phase in and out. And so that causes your signal to sound wavy and weird.
That's how Dennis Quaid could talk with his father.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, Hollywood loved to take advantage of that.
Y'all can say, feel free, you can, to get some food. I know it's a lot of stuff to take in, that pop in the coolers, I know, you know. So feel free to contribute. So Eric wants to know, that's caused due to weather reflection? I think that was for the last question.
So the last question was, what is the characteristics of VHF signals received via auroral reflection?
Okay.
That's the aurora borealis.
That's caused due to water reflection. I think that was actually one question.
Yes, the water one was,
Precipitation, water.
yeah, what weather condition would decrease the range at microwave frequencies? So, yep. If you set up a Wi-Fi transmitter from your house to your barn, and then all of a sudden dense fog moved in, you might lose the internet connection out at your barn because that.
So it's confusing because sometimes the fog is helpful and sometimes the fog is not, depending on.
It depends on the wavelength of the signal. Yep.
Literally black and white.
Yeah.
Literally helpful or not.
Yep. Or in the case of HF, it's neutral. It does nothing. It completely ignores it. So that's why when people say, well, does my radio transmit further than another one based on its power? It's really more based on its wavelength and the characteristics of those wavelengths. Yep. They can only be compared when they're exactly the same. What band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter? The answer is 6-meter band. The reason for that is we need 6 meters is still VHF. Remember, 6 meters was a 50 megahertz band, and VHF is from 30 to 300. So we're going to be able to penetrate the atmosphere, which is important, but we need a signal that has a wavelength big enough to bounce off of the meteors. And so it's the 6-meter band. And believe it or not, meteors are striking the Earth 24 hours a day. So it's not only when you see a meteor shower, and it's not only at night when you can actually see a meteor on occasion. Meteors are constantly striking the Earth. You cannot see them during the day because the sun is brighter than the flash that the meteor makes. And so the way that they do meteor scatter now, especially with computers, is you run a piece of software, you have your computer talking digitally over your radio, sending a very quick data burst. And they have the United States divided in half, and people on the East Coast transmit for 30 seconds straight, while people on the West Coast are listening. And then 30 seconds later, they swap, and the times are all synchronized over the internet. And because you don't know when a meteor is exactly going to hit, and so you just keep blasting your signal out continuously for 30 seconds, hoping that a meteor will fall at that time. And when it does, it will bounce your signal back down to the other side of the country, and they're listening while you're transmitting, and then you flop sides. Prior to that, people would generally have to wait for a meteor storm, and they would be sending out Morse code as fast as possible and hope somebody could possibly receive it at that one given time. Very hard, but now it's become so easy. You just set your computer up and let it run, and it just runs all day, and you come back later and wow, I made contacts. You didn't do anything, you just let it do it. But it is neat because you're using frequency ranges that normally wouldn't allow you to communicate from that far of a distance. So why would you care to do that? Well, what if you're doing one of those contests? We talked about those grid squares. Well, if you need to get a grid square in Washington State, but yet you normally can't communicate that far using voice, then the only way to do it on 6 meters might be meteor scatter.
It's like, why would somebody want to go catch all the birds? Like, identify all birds. That's what I love. What's it called? But it reminds me that like, it's one thing to do. Meaning you're doing things for the fun of it. You're doing things for fun.
Yeah, it's just for fun. It's a challenge. I mean, it's just, yeah. Can anyone get on the radio? Absolutely. Can anyone, just anyone work all grids? No, it's a challenge. So, yep. And they give awards, but sometimes some big plaques. And yep. So this talks about the ionosphere. I know it's hard for the people online to see, but it is in your book. And it shows the different layers. Different layers come out during the day versus the night. The different layers are at different altitudes above the earth. And so typically, as you could imagine, if you bounce your signal off of this nearest layer, it's going to come back not as far away as if you bounce it off this farthest layer, and it comes back much further away. And so depending on the layer, which comes in the daytime or the nighttime, depends on the range of your communications. Also, different bands, different wavelengths are impacted by the different layers. And so at night, when the near layers go away, then the lower frequencies, the longer wavelengths, which are then bouncing off these furthest layers, are the ones that are going to come into play. The reason why the layers go away or come is because the sun, when the sun is in our hemisphere, it's pumping energy into the ionosphere, and it's building up those nearer layers. When the sun is on the other side, at nighttime for us, there's not all that energy, and so those near layers start fading back, and then we only get the outer layers. What part of the atmosphere enables the propagation of radio signals around the world? You learned this today, the ionosphere. On which HF bands does a technician class license operator have phone privileges? So as soon as you get your license, you can use HF, and you can use it with voice, which is important because you probably don't know Morse code. The answer is the 10-meter band. So you can get on HF on 10 meters and use voice communications. The other HF bands that you do have privileges to are Morse code only privileges. So if you don't know Morse code, then you're relegated to 10 meters on HF. Yes, absolutely. Yep, you can set up your computer to transmit and receive Morse code. You know, as a technician, you will have voice privileges, phone privileges on the 10-meter band only. 10-meter band is still quite fun, quite interesting. I remember as a teenager driving with a 10-meter radio in my car. It had a antenna very similar to the CB, because the CB uses the 11-meter band. So they're very similar in size, but clearly not the same. And I was on a 15 or 20 watt radio, so relatively low power, driving in Springfield, Ohio, talking to somebody in the Isle of Man off the coast of Scotland, just like they were in the room with me. So it can be a lot of fun, especially doing it mobile is a unique challenge and definitely helps pass the time. No, it was definitely him. Which of the following is an advantage of HF versus VHF and higher frequencies? And the answer is long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF. So as I mentioned before and put on the drawing, VHF and UHF frequencies will penetrate the ionosphere, where HF signals are typically reflected back. And so because they bounce back, you'll get the worldwide communications. Which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to technician class operator for RTTY and data transmissions? The answer is 10-meter band only. So RTTY is radio teletype. It is essentially a form of digital data transmission. And so you will be able to do that only on the 10-meter band. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? And a beacon is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing radio propagation or related experimental activities. So what a beacon is and how that's commonly used is there will be beacon stations set up around the world on different bands, and they just sit there and beacon out. They sit there and transmit their call sign. Usually that's it. They just over and over and over and over transmitting their call sign. And the purpose for that is, well, if I want to know, can I communicate to somebody in England on the 20-meter band? Well, if I know that there's a beacon on 20 meters in England on a certain frequency that somebody set up, I'll tune there and I'll listen for it. If I can hear it, then I know that the radio waves are propagating between England and my location. Maybe they aren't. Maybe 20 minutes later they are. It just depends on the atmospheric conditions. But it allows you to tell where signals are coming from around the world. There's a digital mode called Whisper, and it uses your computer, and it's typically very low power. And it's very neat because it's all computer controlled, and you can view the Whisper stations on the internet. The really neat thing about it is if you wanted to test an antenna design or see where your signal is able to be received at any given point, you set up Whisper on a radio, you hook it up, you start transmitting, and nearly instantaneously, every Whisper station that hears you immediately reports that on the internet. And then you start seeing on a map little lights lighting up everywhere in the world that your signal is able to be received. So it's a very interesting. And so if you were building or testing different types of antennas and wanting to reach certain parts of the world, you could utilize that to help determine what setup works best. What is generally the best time for long distance 10-meter band propagation via the F layer? So after you get your license, you'll be able to use 10 meters. You want to be able to gain the greatest distance in your communications. And the answer is going to be from dawn to shortly after sunset during the periods of high sunspot activity. So you're going to want to communicate.
They're telling me they can hear us. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, can you hear me now? This is not the
Yes,
Verizon
they've got you.
commercial. This is
5 by
ham
5.
radio.
Woo.
All right. So you want to get on 10 meters, the best time is during the daytime. So from dawn to just after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. Which of the following results from the fact that skip signals refracted from the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? The answer is either vertical or horizontally polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception. So the reason for that is your antenna, remember we talked about vertical polarization where the wavelength actually runs vertically as opposed to horizontally where it's back and forth. However you originate that signal, once it bounces off the ionosphere, there's no way of knowing how it's going to return. It doesn't just go vertically and stay that way because it's not direct, it's being reflected off. And so because of that, it's elliptically polarized, circularly polarized. And so you can use an antenna in either polarization effectively because that signal is actually going to arrive sometimes vertically and sometimes horizontally and sometimes somewhere in between. It's going to be all over the place. Which of the following propagation types is most commonly associated with occasional strong over-the-horizon signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands? The answer is sporadic E. Sporadic E is just a very strong E layer, which is a very near layer of the ionosphere that will interact with these, that's 10 meters is HF, but interact with these VHF signals. And instead of completely penetrating through the atmosphere, you will get some reflection. And so you'll be able to communicate over great distances, much further than you normally would be able to. And it says it's typically during the summertime. Why during the summertime? Because the Earth is closest to the sun during the summertime, and so the sun's energy is charging that ionosphere much greater than when it's further away in the wintertime. Which of the following bands may provide long-distance communications during the peak of the sunspot cycle? The answer is 6 or 10 meters. So the sunspot cycle is the cycle at which the sun is emitting maximum radiation into the earth, and it comes in a 7-year cycle. Remember, the sun is irradiating the ionosphere, but what frequencies don't really care about the ionosphere? They just punch right on through. 23 centimeter band. 23 centimeters is really small. That's like that, right? That's a very small wavelength that goes right through. 70 centimeter band or 1.25 meter bands. Again, we're talking about centimeters, very small wavelengths that punch through the ionosphere. So we know that neither of those are correct. So obviously all the above can't be correct. And so the only ones that have longer wavelengths that could possibly interact with the ionosphere would be your 6 and 10 meter bands.
These are all known.
Yes. Yep, they are completely known. So we're in the 25th solar cycle. It's a 7-year cycle, so 7 times 25, and is back to when we started counting it. And they produce weather predictions, solar weather predictions, and so they will announce when. And in fact, there was a huge solar storm that just occurred within the last month that took out like 25 of Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. Yeah. And so that was solar radiation so powerful that it wirelessly went through the space and destroyed the electronics. Done. Irrecoverable. They will fall. Yep. Yep, they will fall. And they'll fall and burn up in the atmosphere. Yep. But that same energy is what's charging these layers of the ionosphere and causing signals to bounce off of them better or worse than any other time. So when the sunspot cycle is high, these which this HF frequency, but it's the top of the HF frequency. It's the smallest wavelength. So it takes a lot of energy in the ionosphere to reflect off of it. Otherwise, it wants to try to go through a little bit. But in order to work well, we want it to bounce off the most. So we need the most energy. And so in this peak of the sunspot cycle, 10 meters will be really active. When the sunspot cycle is down, 10 meters is dead. It's like a CB. It's good for 5 miles up the highway. It's very low local communications.
So do you guys get excited when the sunspot's high? Do you guys get on there?
Yeah, oh yeah, yep. Yeah. What is the property of a radio wave? What property of a radio wave is used to describe its polarization? Okay, we've already talked. You should be able to eliminate 2 of the answers to get down to 50-50. Remember, it's the orientation of the signal, whether it's vertical or horizontal, or it could even possibly be circular. But it is the electric field. And if you remember, it's a radio wave is it's an electromagnetic wave because it has both properties. But if you think about it's the electricity that goes through the air, it gets to your signal, and that voltage comes on into your radio. If you think of it that way, you'll remember it's the electric field. And it's the orientation of it. Is that vertical or is it horizontal? Which of the following is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals received by ionospheric refraction? And the answer is random combining of signals arriving via different paths. So as I mentioned before, as we're driving, you've got a signal that comes to you straight and one that bounces off and then it arrives to you. Well, just like that, these are signals bouncing off the ionosphere and arriving at different times, and they're causing interference to themselves. All right. What is the FCC part definition of a space station? And the answer is an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. So it's any amateur transmitter in space. Which amateur radio stations may make contact with an amateur radio station on the International Space Station using 2 meters and 70 centimeter frequency bands? The answer is any amateur holding a technician or higher class license. So there is a ham radio aboard the International Space Station, and you can communicate to the astronauts, although typically communicating to the astronauts is reserved for classrooms. They typically don't allow it for the general public just because there's only so much time that the astronauts have, and they want to make sure that educational use gets it. But there are amateur radio stations other than voice communications on the International Space Station. So they have packet, which is somewhat similar to email, although we do actually have email over ham radio, but it's basically digital messages, like type a message and send it to you. So essentially like email. Well, there's a packet station on the International Space Station. So I could take my 2 meter radio, which normally might only have a range of 30 or 50 miles. I can send you a packet message to the International Space Station as it flies above me. And then as it gets to the other side of the world and back into England, and someone in England receives that message down from the International Space Station. So it carried it for me. It held it as digital data. And then once it got over England, popped it down and they received it. They also have satellites that you can talk through on the International Space Station. And so I can point my signal up at the International Space Station and follow it as it travels across the sky. Because if I point it here, about 5 seconds later, it's now over here. So you have to track it. So you have to have a special antenna rotor that moves it. Or sometimes people will take their handheld radio with a handheld antenna and just follow it this way. You can tell if it's getting out of the way because it'll get scratchy, and you move until it sounds good, and it follows an arc. And you can talk to the International Space Station even with a handheld radio. And it relays just like a repeater to somebody else that's on the receiving end, very far away, 1,000 miles or more, that you're able to talk to them. The reason why it's not a repeater is because it's a satellite and it uses what they call a transponder. And unlike a repeater, which has a single input frequency and a single output frequency, satellite transponders have ranges of frequencies that they listen on. And it's a one-to-one match to a range on the uplink and the downlink, different frequency up, different frequency down, just like a repeater, except it does it on a range. And so if I could be transmitting on 145.1 and you could be transmitting on 145.2, and we both can be transmitting simultaneously, and my signal comes out on 443.1 and yours comes out on 443.2, like they're mapped together, but it's across a range. And so multiple conversations can occur through that at the same time.
Question, but not allowed to talk because it's not 10 meter for tech class, is that right?
No, so in the case that they're talking about here, which is 2 meters and 70 centimeters, technician class licenses have full privileges on VHF and UHF bands. So these are VHF and UHF bands.
You could, but you don't normally get through the space station.
Well, getting through to talk to the astronauts, you don't normally get, but you're allowed to. They just don't. They won't let you.
Bounce the signal, usually just bounces the signal of the digital stuff, right? Or will it bounce your voice too?
Well, the voice is not talking to the astronaut. It's using the satellite repeater on board the space station.
Can you do that with your voice too?
Yeah, and you're talking to not the astronaut, you're talking to somebody else.
You can shoot your voice too.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
just they may not respond, is that what you're saying? Like it's getting there?
There's two different things. One is talking to astronauts and one is using it as a computer. You're not talking, it's just going through. to the other
Yeah,
side.
that's correct. So,
Talking to their command center or
well, you're talking to the satellite transponder that's aboard the spacecraft. That's under automatic control. They're not using it. They're not part of it. It's different than the radio that they've got up there with them that they won't talk to you on, but would talk to prearranged classroom environments. Yep. But I could talk to somebody across the country using that transponder aboard the space station. But I'm not talking to the astronaut, but I am talking through the equipment on the space station. Yep. What do the initials LEO tell you about an amateur satellite? LEO is low Earth orbit. So typically, just the thing to learn to know about that is satellites that are in low Earth orbit circle the Earth. They're not stationary, they move. Okay, that's why you have to track that signal across the sky. Geosynchronous satellites, which are satellites that are in synchronous orbit with the Earth, like your satellite dish TV antenna. Your satellite dish now, the DirecTV dish network, that doesn't move, that's fixed. And that's because the satellite that it receives is fixed in space and it rotates with the Earth. It stays in your view all the time. And so if you want to get into satellites, you could buy a satellite transceiver. You can then buy a antenna rotor that not only rotates your antenna horizontally, but vertically. And then you can get a computer interface for all of that. And you can download from the internet what the path is, and the software can alert you that, hey, there's a satellite coming into your view. And then you click on it, and the computer will automatically control your rotor and move the antenna over and up and point at the satellite. And then as it's passing overhead, it keeps constant track for you. You don't have to do anything except operate your radio. And in fact, then your computer can even control your radio, because as the satellite moves, you have to adjust for the frequency drift of the satellite. It's called Doppler shift. And so if you've ever stood on the side of the road when an ambulance is approaching, it makes the pitch changes as it comes closer and goes away. That's Doppler shift. The pitch, the frequency of the siren never changed from what it's sending, but because the distance that it takes as it's nearing you and then going away shifts the frequency that you perceive it at. Satellites work the same way. So as they're arcing across the sky, they're at one distance, and as they're moving, you have to adjust for that. And you can have a computer controlled setup that would track all that for you, or you could do it yourself. Yeah, so the question was that in the book, it says that the typical pass time for a low Earth orbit satellite is between 2 and 6 minutes. And yes, that means that that satellite may be overhead for as little as 2 and for as much as 6 minutes. So that's the window of opportunity that you have to talk. Yeah, very brief. And it may not come back around for another 24 hours. It may come around sooner, but typically, again, not very fast.
I think we've seen that like in movies, like when they're talking to somebody, and then you gotta wait now, guys, or lost the signal.
Yep. That's what the one thing that I love about ham radios. We've all seen these kind of things, but just we don't understand them. Oh, is that just the movie? Now we actually know why, and that's real. Yeah. I remember the movie Contact.
Yes.
And I remember when that came out, I think I was probably around 16. And they showed the picture and showed the guy building the station underneath the giant satellite dish, and it had dry ice pouring out. And I told my aunt, I said, that's a low noise satellite receiver. And she's like, what are you talking about? And it's because at those very, very high frequencies, microwave frequencies, that you need to actually cool that equipment to keep the frequency stable, because it runs hot, and that's why they had that. And I knew that because of ham radio. So yeah. That's right. Yep. Which of the following are provided by satellite tracking programs? The answer is all the above. So maps that show the real-time position of the satellite track over the Earth, the time, the azimuth, and the elevation of the start, the maximum, and end of a pass, and the apparent frequency of the satellite transmission, including effects of the Doppler shift. So again, with the computer and a proper satellite program and enough interfacing, you can have your radio adjusted, and you can have the antenna automatically pointed in and be alerted when that satellite's going to be overhead. Which of the following are inputs to a satellite tracking program? The answer is the Keplerian elements. Those elements are what's here. The time, the azimuth, the elevation, the start, the maximum, the frequency, all of these data points, those are called Keplerian elements or data sets. What is a satellite beacon? Well, we know what a beacon is. We talked about that before. Well, it's a transmission from a satellite that contains status information. So it's just beaconing out. There are a lot of non-amateur satellites that you can pick up and decode their beacon data. And so it might be interesting to see what is beaming down. It's beaming down probably the voltage of its batteries, the voltage of its solar panels, maybe the speed and temperature that it's operating in. Not things that you need to know, but hey, it's pretty cool. I decoded this off of a satellite. No, it's data. So you'd use a computer. Yep. Yep. There are weather satellites in outer space that you can decode yourself. There are articles on how to build an antenna for it. Put together a very simple radio. I'm talking about a radio that you can get for $20 and build an antenna for another $20, and you can set this up and decode weather satellites. And so you can get the weather maps directly from that. What if all infrastructure went down? The local TV station is off the air. The internet is down. Nothing works. That satellite's not affected. It's still in outer space, transmitting that down. You could absolutely decode that and print off your own weather maps, the same ones that your local TV and radio station is getting. You can do that yourself.
Unless the infrastructure's down. We neutron bombs.
Yes, well, yeah. What mode of transmission is commonly used by amateur radio satellites? The answer is all the above. Single sideband, FM, CW. CW is Morse code and data.
Is it stand for code word?
CW stands for continuous wave. Who may receive telemetry from a space station? Excuse me. Anyone. Anyone can receive the telemetry signal because it's receiving. There's no restriction on what you can receive. And that again would include non-amateur satellites. So there's weather satellites. Those are operated by NOAA, the National Oceanographic Aeronautical Association, NOAA, whatever it is. So those are government satellites. You can absolutely tune in and receive those. There have been satellites that have been lost. They just went offline, dead, uncontrollable, and written off. And ham radio operators, through scanning and listening, happen to pick them up sometimes many, many years later. Something happened, maybe a battery cell shorted out and the thing went dead, but over the last 20 years, the sun shining on the solar panels kind of rejuvenated the battery, and the thing popped back to life, and it was ham radio operators that reported that satellite's not dead anymore. So if people, yeah, that would absolutely be news for that. Yep. Telemetry is basically status data. Yep. I would say, here's what my battery voltage is. Here's what the temperature is. Yep. What telemetry information is typically transmitted by satellite beacons? Health and status of the satellite. Often, especially with governmental satellites, it is entirely possible that the primary payload of the satellite would be encrypted, but the telemetry data may be unencrypted because they want people to be able to decode. It's harmless and maybe helps them track or understand what's going on with the satellite, but yet that satellite could be relaying military government top secret information. That part would be encrypted, but the telemetry you would be able to decode. And so, yeah, it's very common to be able to decode data off of a satellite. What causes spin fading of satellite signals? The answer is the rotation of the satellite and its antennas. So you think of the satellite as a ball, and it's got an antenna on it that's transmitting, and I'm here. Great, that antenna can see me, but when the satellite spins and all of a sudden the antenna is on the backside of it, what's going to get interference from the body of the satellite. So because the satellite's constantly spinning, you'll get this spin fading. So the signal may sound strong and weak and sound strong and weak. With regard to satellite communications, what is Doppler shift? Doppler shift is the observed change in the signal frequency caused by the relative motion between the satellite and the Earth station. So that's what I mentioned before with the ambulance, that as it approaches and then goes away, the tone of its siren changes. That is Doppler shift. Which of the following is a good way to judge whether your uplink power is neither too low nor too high? The answer is your signal strength on the downlink should be about the same as the beacon. And so the satellite is going to have a beacon, which is its signal originating at the satellite, and you're going to tune it in, and on your meter it shows a 5. And then you transmit through the satellite, and just like the frequency has a frequency range and it maps to a frequency range on its output, it has a power mapping as well. The stronger the signal you put into the satellite, the stronger the signal the satellite will put out. You want to use the lowest signal strength required to maintain communications. If you just ram that signal in there, full power, and cause the satellite to then send a very strong signal back down, you're draining the batteries of that satellite. It's better to just use the minimum necessary. It's also the law that you haven't covered it yet, but the law in what you'll see in your book says how much power should you use, and the law says that you should or you must use the minimum amount necessary to maintain reliable communications. You don't have to be scratchy and hard to hear, but you also don't need to, if 50 watts works, you don't need to say, well, 50 was good, 500 will be better. It's not needed, so you just don't do that. There's a power knob on your radio. Yep, it's just that simple. There's a power knob. Theoretically, it would be possible to have your radio harmed by too strong of a signal, but not usually over such a great distance. It's more likely that if you and your neighbor become ham radio operators, and you're across the street from each other, then it would be possible to have a strong enough signal that could harm their radio. But you'd also have to be on the same frequency, and not that likely. What is the impact of using too much effective radiated power on a satellite uplink? Blocking access by other users. So the signal leaves less reserve power for everyone else, perhaps blocking access by other users. Because if the satellite battery drains too low, it shuts down and charges its batteries. So you don't want to abuse the system. No, because you're overloading the battery. Yeah, it would be like the solar panel might overload its battery. You're draining it. What is meant by the statement that a satellite is operating in mode UV? The satellite uplink is in the 70 centimeter band, which is UHF, and the downlink is on the 2 meter band, which is VHF. So it's just indicating to you It has a UHF and a VHF uplink and downlink. How we doing?
About 14 minutes.
14 minutes? Okay. Oh, this stuff is not fun because this stuff is usually going to be just memorization. It's not something that, oh, I learned that so I can figure it out. It's just going to be memory. What code is used when sending CW in the amateur bands? International Morse code. Which of the following VHF, UHF frequency ranges are limited to CW only? I have a trick for this one. The trick is Morse code is always at the lowest end of the frequency range for a given band and always in a very small amount of frequency. So 50, now this helps if you happen to know that the 6-meter band is from 50 to 54 megahertz, but even if you don't, 50.0 to 50.1, that's a pretty small amount of space. And 144.0 to 144.1, again, a very small amount of space. Helps if you know that the 2-meter band is from 144 to 148, so that you would also know that that's at the very bottom of the range. 219 to 220 megahertz, that's 1 megahertz wide. That's not very small, that's a lot. Because this is only 100 kilohertz, 1/10 of this amount. At 420 to 420.1, they're trying to trick you because that is a quite small amount, but because they included that big one, that answer is wrong. 902 to 0.0 to 902.1, they're going to get you on that one too. They're trying to trick you, but in fact, there is no Morse code section for this frequency range. So if you can remember the frequency bands that you are most familiar with on VHF and UHF, it's not going to be this 900 megahertz. You can eliminate that. You can eliminate that one because it's too big, and then hopefully you'll remember to get your A. So just remember, it's at the very lowest portion of the band and the very smallest amount of bandwidth. Because Morse code takes up a very little amount of bandwidth. You could have a ton of Morse code communications in that 100 kilohertz space. Very few, a very large amount of communication. So what is an electronic keyer? It's a device that assists in manual sending of Morse code. So if you've all seen like the old-fashioned telegraph key, so it's got that a paddle on a plate and they push it down and did it. Okay, that's a Morse code key. An electronic keyer typically has a set of paddles, parallel paddles that you hit with your hand like this. And one paddle is a dot and the other one is a dash, and it sends them out perfectly. Now you still have to control it, whether you want a dot or a dash, but it makes it perfect because it's controlled by a circuit. And so every dot and every dash is exactly the correct length. Because what happens if I send, a quick dot in my dash, which normally should last 1/3 of a second, but I only have it last 1/2 of a second, or make it last 1/2 a second. It's off, it's irregular. This electronic keyer allows it to go perfectly. It's still manually controlled. It's not a computer doing it. It is just a circuit making the dots and dashes perfect. How might a computer be used as part of an amateur radio station? All the above, for logging contacts and contact information, so you can keep electronic log of who you talk to. If you want awards for contacting people in different countries and different places, you'll want to log those contacts. For sending or receiving Morse code, yep, you can hook your computer up and it can send Morse code and receive it for you. Or for generating and decoding digital signals. So obviously, if you're doing any kind of digital and data, you're going to need a computer for that. How is a computer sound card used when conducting digital communications? The sound card provides audio to the radio's microphone input and converts the received audio to digital form. Everybody in here has probably used dial-up internet or seen or heard a fax machine. It is taking sound and making weird sounds and sending that as data over a phone line. Your sound card on your computer is doing the exact same thing, just over the radio. That's how that works. Which of the following connections might be used between a voice transceiver and a computer for digital operation? So receive audio, transmit audio, and push to talk. So if you're going to receive digital data communication from your radio, well, you're going to need to hook up the receive audio so it can hear the signal coming in. You're going to have to hook up your transmit audio so you can send your digital signal out. And you're going to need to hook up the push to talk so that your radio knows when to transmit and when to receive. So it switches back and forth. And your computer is going to control all of that. So those are the three connections that you would need. Which computer sound card port is connected to a transceiver's headphone or speaker output for operating digital modes? The microphone or input line. Okay, so you need to take sound from your radio, which comes out of your radio's speaker. And how does your computer hear? With a microphone. So the speaker goes into the microphone. Kind of like we talked about with the repeaters. You're going to receive on one and transmit on the other. Or if we take the cell phones and we want them to talk, we have to flip them upside down so that the receiver goes to the transmitter and the transmitter goes to the receiver. It's the same concept here. Which of the following connections might be used between a voice transceiver and a computer for digital operation? The answer is all the above. Those are all different communications modes. There's nothing to explain about it other than remember that. What is FT8? Is a digital mode capable of operating in low signal to noise conditions that transmits on 15-second intervals. This is just a thing to remember. Some of these digital modes are so amazing that if you tuned your radio to try to listen to them, the signals could be so weak that all you hear is static. But yet your computer is able to pull a signal out of there and start decoding it. And in fact, it may not only decode one signal, it may decode dozens of signals simultaneously. Which of the following operating specialties is supported by digital mode software in the WSJT suite? All of the above. Just memorize it. That's there's no trick to this. WSJT supports all of these different types of communications. Which of the following may be included in packet transmissions? All the above. A checksum that permits error detection, similar to the check of that formal traffic message. This just allows the computer to make sure that the data received is all there. It doesn't tell it what's missing. It just says, is it good or am I missing it? And if I'm missing it, I better ask for it again. A header that contains the call sign of the station to which the information is being sent, and an automatic repeat request in case of an error. So if we go back and think about that formal message, what was there? A check and that preamble, the header, that information that says where the message came from. Those two things are common there. And because you know that those two are right, then all the choices must be correct. Maybe that could help you out if you can remember that. What is an ARQ transmission system? A digital scheme whereby the receiving station detects errors and sends a request to the sending station to retransmit the information. ARQ stands for automatic repeat request. So if you can just remember automatic repeat request, and what is that doing? Oh, it detects the error and says, hey, I've got an error. Please resend me whatever you sent because it was messed up. What may occur if data signals arrive via multiple paths? Error rates are likely to increase. We've talked several times about signals arriving via multiple paths and what happens. They become distorted or garbled. Well, if I'm sending data, which is very finite, right? If I'm talking and all of a sudden a bit of my voice drops out, you still can understand and your brain will reconstruct what I'm saying. But if I'm sending you ones and zeros, the computer either gets them or it doesn't. Something was missed. And if something's missed, it's going to say it's no good. So if the signal arrives via multiple paths, it comes in garbled, well, then the error rates are going to increase. The amount of errors on that signal go up because there's interference. What does the term APRS mean? Well, it stands for Automatic Packet Reporting System. And APRS is an amateur mode where you hook a GPS up to your radio and you can beacon out your location. And so people can then track where you're at. You can track where other people are at. There are some more advanced utilizations of those systems that based on your GPS information, it can say, oh, you're in Milford. There's a repeater in Milford, and it automatically switches your radio to that repeater. Or, hey, other people are nearby. Other ham radio operators are in your area, and it can pull up and show you on a map where they're located. And so you can communicate to them. It can also beacon out general information like what frequency your radio is tuned to. So if I see you drive into the area, not only do I see where you're at, but I can tell, oh, you're on that national simplex calling frequency. I'll tune over there and talk to you.
I think we're at our time.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna, and I think this mic will work here. Matthew, thank you so much. This was, raise your hand and raise your hand if this makes a lot more sense than just the book. Thank you, Jesus, for Matthew. If we all had been trying to do this for the book, I think that we would have just like buckled under memorization. Like, do you feel like you may actually be able to operate the thing, not just pass the test through memorization? Okay, so here's how tomorrow is going to work.